I think of Shakespeare's Shylock. If you prick us, do we not bleed? And if you tickle us, do we not laugh? It is our humanity and all the potential within it that makes us beautiful.
They are really clever, because they scout you when you are 15, 16, 17. So of course it's easy to manipulate you.
Just adding to perpetuating a world of just making money out of women's insecurities.
But it's not all glitz and glamour. Influenced by a constant bombardment of media images, everyday girls are literally dying to be thin.
The supermodels are getting thinner. This means that if the young person gets hold of the idea that the way to feel good about yourself is to slim, to be like a supermodel, she finds that she's battling against her natural body structure, which is to actually be bigger, and in consequence, she's at risk.
My skeleton literally was the one of a woman of 70 years old. It was so damaged, I had lost all my hair. So we have to change how people think, we have to change how designers think and how they see beauty, because it's all their fault. For me it is.
Has that quality of child woman thing, which touches a nerve with men especially.
On the one hand, it's almost reassuring to know that Kate Moss has to make an awful lot of effort and a huge amount of sacrifices to be that skinny, because I think some people think that you can do that naturally. And
that's allegedly derived from and glamorizes the appearance of someone who's strung out on heroin.
It's kind of like looking in the mirror, pause, and there it is. And it's not going anywhere.
The 90s were a toxic time to be a young girl, with increasingly definitive constructs of what is considered acceptable beauty. Fashion magazines and modern print media constructed a femininity that was embedded with a body-conscious and gendered narrative. The spectacle presented a loss of control, which disturbed perceptions of the closed messages contained in fashion magazines. Hip bones were considered a badge of honour during this time, and supermodels such as Kate Moss and Jodie Kidd were glorified for their emaciated figures, and young girls were conditioned to believe they were only acceptable if they had a minimal layer of fat on their bodies. These ideals were driving product and experience advertising. It was everywhere, whether people were looking for it or not, whether interested in the fashion industry or not. People were exposed to these images on television, on billboards, on buses, posters, and on general advertising for non-fashion products. The ideal of this time, although both women and men were being targeted and bombarded with it, was highly unattainable healthily, and many of the leading supermodels presenting this ideal attained such a look through extreme drug use or starvation. The terms heroin chick and waif became used non-ironically by high fashion publications. It became used generally when talking about fashion and advertising, but it was not a look of health and happiness, rather a look of ambiguity reflecting millennial anxiety. The appeal of excess and danger communicated through heroin chick persuaded young people to imitate the behaviours because they not only wanted the products being marketed to them, but they also wanted the lifestyle. However, this look and lifestyle came at a cost and brought along with it detrimental consequences to both the mental and physical well-being of its audience. This just shows the power of advertising campaigns, and in particular magazines and front covers, in influencing impressionable individuals who constantly seek new thrills. This influenced their behaviour by supplying a set of religious-like rules to live by in order to be accepted within society's narrow confines of what and how a woman should be. After hundreds of deaths from the extreme heroin use to try and attain this glamorized look, US President Bill Clinton demanded a stop to the deathly fad.
But the glorification of heroin is not creative, it's destructive, it's not beautiful, it is ugly. And this is not about art, it's about life and death. And glorifying death is not good for any society.
This came after the tragic death of 20-year-old fashion photographer David Sorrenti, who died in February 1997 after a fatal heroin overdose. Shortly after, New York advertising columnist Barbara Lippert commented on the media obsession with asceticizing darkness and drug abuse to sell product. She wrote, "In this media culture, there's been every sex act and every tattoo and every piercing possible, and they have to keep getting more and more extreme until they get to death. Now they've done death." This was an accusation to the fashion and media industry for their constant seeking of on-the-edge desire in order to shock and devote craving for danger. However, her argument is, what will ever be enough? When does advertising become real and no longer a fantasy? However, British photographer Corinne Day, who used more urban and realistic settings to her fashion photographs, argued that unlike the unrealistic expectations constructed in fantasy fashion imagery, with the use of post-production manipulations, heroin chic represented a far more realistic image of women and reflected the honest grit of the lives of young people at the time. However, it can be argued that although young people began to take heroin on a daily basis to try and live the lifestyle, this was a result of the unrealistic ideal which they couldn't help but consume.
Looking at the magazines when I first started working for them, and looking and seeing that everybody was living in fantasy world or escapism world, I tried to inject experiences, true life experiences, my personal life experiences. I think when you look at documentary style imagery next to the fantasy style imagery, I think, in my point of view, the documentary style trivialises the fantasy world, and I just think there's too much of it in the magazines. I think you need a balance. I'm not saying that fantasy is not relevant, it is, but it's good to have a balance.
Similarly to Corinne's work, British fashion image and filmmaker Nick Knight also believes the frivolity of fashion days are well and truly over. The non-model is a mechanism in his portrayal of a much more realistic reading of contemporary societal issues, which cultivate in both him and the audience a profound understanding of the individual subject and their experiences.
So I see things which I think are either unjust or unpleasant or unfair or plain stupid, and I want to some degree talk about them in my work. It's not very nice when you see people who aren't being included in society simply because of the colour of their skin or the age they are or the weight they have or whatever it is. So those things are quite naturally upsetting, and quite naturally I want to try and speak about those in my work. But
Nick's image making deviates the narrow percepts of beauty conveyed throughout much of the 90s fashion and visual media culture. Nick's work provides a radical arbitration to the previously glorified projections of idealised beauty and lifestyle promotion through a fashion platform. The models in Nick's photographs align with an avant-garde approach to fashion design, which provides an obscure neglect to traditional photographic language. The autonomous distortion of the body within his work reflects the conflict of a dysmorphic relationship with the body, perhaps inflicted by the corruptive assault of the 90s.
It's not an honest system, and I don't like it. So I started a website 20 years ago. It wasn't in kowtow of the advertisers. It wasn't run on a system of showing clothes that the advertiser wanted you to show. I started it to be able to express themselves in a much more, well, hopefully much more interesting way, and to say things that other magazines or that you couldn't say anywhere else in the fashion press.
He launched his influential fashion website, Show Studio, in November 2000 to showcase a holistic creative process from start to end, in order to connect designers, artists and audience in a thought-provoking engagement through fashion imagery and filmmaking. Nick has worked with top UK fashion and lifestyle publications, targeted at both mainstream and niche audiences, including British Vogue, ID, Dazed and Confused, Visionaire and The Face. He's also worked alongside some of the world's leading designers, including Alexander McQueen, Yohji Yamamoto, Gareth Pugh and Christian Dior, to name a few.
And always working with Alexander McQueen was, you knew he'd be pushing boundaries, and that's what I like to do as well, because I don't like to be dull, and there are lots of unanswered questions in life. And photography and image making and filmmaking and fashion are all ways of, finding out more about life. It's a very a good way of finding out who you are, what the world's about, all those sorts of things, because as a photographer, I'm allowed into lots of different people's lives. So I can just phone up somebody and say, you know, can I take your photograph? And it could be anybody from, you know, a miner coming off shift to a heroin addict to, you know, President of America. So, you know, as a photographer, you're allowed access into virtually every part of society, is what I'm trying to say. And so it's a very good way to sort of find out more about life. And I think that we don't understand life, we don't understand the world we live in, and, you know, what you see in my work is just my curiosity into life and just what I'm interested in and what frustrates me and what I'm in love with and what I hate and, you know, what I'm frightened of and all those sorts of feelings that you have quite normally about life. But the garment is the central narrative. That, as a fashion photographer, that's what you're trying to do, is expand the narrative that's in the garment. So that's why I work closely with great designers like Alexander McQueen or John Galliano or Reikau Kubo from Comme des Garçons or Yohji Moto or Gareth Pugh, because all these people have really interesting opinions on life. Being able to see the world through Alexander McQueen's eyes, which effectively is what you're doing when you're working with somebody, is fascinating. And I tend to go towards people whose lives are very different from mine and who have a very different opinion of life. I don't work with people who are just a replica of me. What would be the point? Alexander McQueen and I worked on a project perhaps every sort of 3 or 4 months together. He was a very exciting person to work with, and I had a lot of fondness and admiration for him. So this was another one of the projects that we worked on together. I think one of the things that was interesting, and I didn't realise until quite a while after the shoot was done, is there's virtually no imagery in art, in the history of art, of people who have disabilities, physical disabilities, in any way that's at all sort of aspirational. So if you look back through the history of painting, people with physical disabilities are often, you know, regarded as kind of, you know, the lowest of the low.
A prime example of how Nick challenged the preconceptions of idealised beauty which dominated the 90s fashion scene was the September 1998 image series Access Able for Dazed and Confused magazine, guest edited by Alexander McQueen. For this image series, McQueen paired less able-bodied models with designers including Mark Quinn, Hussein Chalian and Jean-Paul Gaultier, including pairing his own designs with Paralympian Amy Mullins. Each designer tailored their garments to fit the needs of their individual models, which allowed for a relationship to be built with the designer as a model and for the garments to form a collective narrative for the person wearing them. This provided a challenge to traditional fashion imagery of the 90s, whereby models throughout this time were often objectified in order to let the garment sell itself on the body of a familiar aesthetic ideal. However, Access Able featured in Dazed and Confused, which at the time wasn't much a place for view in mainstream fashion advertisements as was Vogue. Therefore, the messages communicated throughout this magazine often contain controversial conflict with the conformity of commodity with competitor publications. Nick's work featured in this publication, often for that particular reason, and in both his and McQueen's endeavour to explore the boundaries of what beauty meant, often resulted in a harmonising relationship through their collaborations.
You know, talking about how it could be interesting to use fashion to explore this, you know, idea of what a sexy woman could look like, or, you know, what sensuality or sexuality and how it can be portrayed, you know. Because we see a pretty one-note version of that oftentimes.
The use of models who were considered disabled redirected the conventional relationship between subject and photographer. Female subjects who were previously shot by a male photographer had been done so through the male gaze, which focused more so on appeasing a male consumer than identifying with a female audience. However, with Nick's photography in this series, perhaps even if we have an inkling of the disability that is there, the subjects are presented in a way which suggests the disability almost brings a strength, instead of being the subject of an erotic fantasy being played out for commercial benefit. They instead provided a challenge to the female audience to their existing understanding of what beauty ideals meant. The images disrupted existing perceptions of reading imagery, which they had previously thought was the beauty ideal of the time. In a sense, this can be quite uncomfortable for the viewer, as they are encouraged to confront their own beliefs of themselves based against the standard they'd compared themselves against prior to viewing these images.
It's provocative without being exploitative, and that is what
the explorations that Lee had as their backbone. It was like, how far can we push? Can we keep finding these places where people are holding on to rigid positions of beauty and form and shoulds and musts? And where can we use attitude and storytelling, just energy?
I'm going to focus on the images in the series of Amy Mullins. The first image is the cover of the magazine, in which Amy is bare on the upper body and wears only knee-length running tights and her prosthetic running blades. There is an unnatural element to the prosthesis, whereby the natural body ends and the artificial extension begins. But the question is, where does the body end and where do the extensions begin, if they are so crucial to the abilities of the physical body? It is a question of the real and unreal, and this makes the viewer feel slightly disturbed, as they cannot see everything, and so the image raises more questions than it answers.
The thought process behind what he was doing was saying, like, it's so easy to shock people. It's not interesting. It's temporal. What's interesting is provoking people to think.
The other two images in the series present Amy wearing garments designed by Alexander McQueen, including a crinoline and Victorian undergarments. The soft pale skin, youth and slimness, which were all characteristic of mainstream fashion photography, and unsettling amalgamation with less celebrated flaws to the human body, create a sense of uncanny desire within the audience, because although it is something they feel they should not covet, it becomes a helpless engrossment.
Now, whatever you do, don't stare at her legs. When, of course, that's the point.
The contrast of ideals presented in these images raise questions of bodily unity and bring a sense of fragmentation to the images.
It can transform the thing that might have made people fearful into something that invites them to look a little longer and maybe even understand.
The disjunction between the physical and artificial body are explored. This highlights the viewer's identification with the representation of the double as an inadequate process whereby this fragmentation between self and other is brought to viewers' attention, if only unconsciously.
Getting people to, shake them up about things that they do without thinking that are incredibly, limiting.
Adam Geksky and Vicky Karaminas, in their book Fashion's Double, state that French psychoanalytic philosopher Jacques Lacan proposes the logic of the fulfillment of desire, jouissance, which is also the French for orgasm, is built on its rupture. That is, a sensation of fulfilled desire is only a factor in its eternal dissatisfaction, for desire is at best in the passage of its own desiring. One desires to desire. The feeling of fulfillment is but a punctuation mark in a more profound process that has no end except death itself. This draws upon the viewer's desire to be the subject communicated through the fashion image by constant introspection upon oneself for this crave of gratification in representing the ideals exhibited. However, it highlights this process of contentment achieved through fulfillment of representation only leads to further hunger to strive for this coalescence of look and lifestyle. These critics question the authenticity of the fashion image in prevailing scenes from everyday life, as it suggests the viewer's appetite to represent these images are the product of the marketer's ability to draw upon their weaknesses in a strategy based upon assumptions of believability. The images of Amy are complex in their ability to absorb the viewer in an engagement in which they have been taught never to stare. However, the images were so unique to anything of the time that the viewer cannot help but be fascinated by them. However, the fact that disabilities are rendered invisible in the images portrays an enigmatic subjectivity as the viewer perceives an unfamiliar object in a familiar way.
I didn't even realize until the last couple of years after Lee's passing, I got so many letters from people who wrote to me about what that moment in fashion meant to them. But people who were people who are names we all know in fashion, but also people just, you know, someone in school, someone who's 12.
The reception of the image series was positive, as it challenged conceptions of beauty of the time and presented a more realistic view of femininity that wasn't present to us in the 90s commodification of extreme thinness and fatal drug use. In an article by The Independent in 1998, Katie Williams wrote, "Style magazines don't often change the way we think, but a feature on clothes designed for people with disabilities is causing quite a stir." This response was respective of the period in fashion, where the arrival of an authentic but complex dialectic through the medium of a fashion magazine proved disruptive in its ability to provoke an introspective, quite unusual to the receiver in this decade. At this time, models didn't communicate narrative in depth, but were simply used as coat hangers, not to distract from the narrative sewn into the garments. Axis Able, however, provided the viewer with an interesting contradiction, where the model became equally as significant in conveying the designer's position within an avant-garde role.
I think the fact that Lee created his ideas of beauty and images of beauty that were beautiful to him. He wasn't ever trying to appease an existing notion. He was absolutely exploring things that were interesting to him as they became interesting to him.
However, the viewer's own experiences and perceptions of fashion imagery at the time also challenges the reception of the image series, as the fashion industry at this time was excelling in its profitable market of quite intelligible imagery. The use of disabled models raised many negative responses. Prior Axis Able, designers used models to sell a garment or to sell a narrative, and so it is also not uncommon to infer intentions of exploitation around the image series.
I mean, it's 20 years ago this year that I started running on those.
Yeah.
To now, they're completely known.
Yeah, exactly.
And they weren't 17 years ago when I did that shoot. So I don't think it was any less complex. I just think that it was a different image.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, and people reacted to it. I think if people see that image today, they'd completely know what that is.
Many academic sources I have read that comment on the image series all receive the images in a similar way. Alison Bancroft, in her book Fashion and Psychoanalysis, writes, "It makes reference to China dolls and surrealist mannequins, with the blank facial expressions and the foregrounding of prosthetic legs, and her heels are lifted ready to receive the spikes that will secure her to the floor of the window display or in-store podium." Whilst Tomoko Tamari, in her article Body Image and Prosthetic Aesthetics, Disability, Technology and Paralympic Culture, describes Amy as represented as an old Victorian doll, wearing prosthetic legs which have doll-like human shape. Her expression is frozen and lifeless, and her whole body looks stiff. Her performance as a used and forgotten Victorian doll, which is an automation, helps us to present her as a lifeless object. Both critics suggest an objectification of Amy to represent a puppet-like figure, almost as if she is unable to think or act for herself. This comes as a stark contrast to her career as a Paralympian, despite her cyborg-like bionic characteristics.
I didn't see her as a mannequin. I just query your word, because mannequin is another word for dummy, for shoproom dummy, which implies a sort of doll or somebody who, has no thought. I wouldn't have thought I was trying to say that in the front cover. She's a very incredibly intelligent and very interesting young woman. So I certainly wasn't trying to represent her as a shoproom dummy. I'm sorry if that came across that way. It wasn't intended.
But in interviewing Nick Knight, I discovered that it was not at all the intention of the image series. As he explained, it was used to communicate the power of disabled models and to readdress the problematic messages carried by dominant fashion imagery of the time. Even from the title of the series itself, Axis Able, it proves a contradiction to the definitions of the term disability. He suggested that using a Paralympian and someone within such a powerful role as Amy, he could not have ever intended to objectify her to something as devitalising as a shop floor dummy. However, as my study is to analyse the subjectivity of the image series, to rely on academic readings of the images alone was not holistic enough, which is why I wanted to talk to the image maker himself, to understand the initial intentions behind the shoot from both him and Alexander McQueen's perspective. If the image series was done today, it would be received completely differently because of the diversity now present in fashion media. However, at a time when there was one version of beauty being presented through fashion, this shock, although it was a positive move in the right direction, especially for impressionable young girls with the messages it conveyed, raised a lot more questions than intended, and it is possible that this was a consequence of the commodity of fashion at the time, rather than the intellectual empathy of the artists involved. It could even be argued that this was the risk needed to be the first brick in the wall of a very controversial fight to get to the position in fashion we are today.
It was incredibly well received, and it made a huge difference. And also, it was one of those stories that got requested. I think we got a request from some publication across the world, from academic journals to magazines to right across the world every day for at least a year after that story was published. So it was incredibly, had a lot of contact with people, which shows how little people with physical disabilities or different shaped bodies were previously unconsidered. This is something that just hadn't happened in art or in fashion beforehand. Lots of people have photographed people who are missing a limb or whatever, but nobody has said they look amazing and held them up as a position and respect, which is what I did with those models. And I think it was the aspirational desire within the photograph to say, actually, this person looks amazing. I'm stunned by how they physically are, rather than saying, oh, it's such a shame they're missing a leg, but I'll do a nice picture of them. It was really sort of praising people for individuals and not saying to people, you have to fit into a certain body type to be considered as beautiful. But that reflected a very large feeling I had throughout the 90s, a sort of frustration with mainstream fashion, that it was only reflecting one sort of body type. It's much, much narrower than that story. Really, if you look at the front cover of Vogue throughout most of the 80s and 90s, you only see one sort of woman a generation, or taking 20 years for that story to start to have its effect. But if you look at what Edward Enninful is now doing at British Vogue, that's a big step in saying to, putting out the message that actually, Vogue is inclusive of more than just one sort of woman. I tried to fight that throughout the whole of my career, not because I'm some sort of person with a mission, but it's just because it doesn't fit into how I look at life.
Conversation with society has changed profoundly in this last decade. It is no longer a conversation about overcoming deficiency. It's a conversation about augmentation. It's a conversation about potential. A prosthetic limb doesn't represent the need to replace loss anymore. It can stand as a symbol that the wearer has the power to create whatever it is that they want to create in that space. So people that society once considered to be disabled can now become the architects of their own identities, and indeed continue to change those identities by designing their bodies from a place of empowerment.